Data collection and sampling. So in this screencast, I'm really just recapping the material that was provided in Johnson and Christensen. So there's not much to add to what's already written. There are certain sampling terms you should be aware of as it relates to both quantitative and qualitative research. And this screencast just reviews those terms and provides maybe a paraphrased version of what you've already read or maybe haven't read, and this can be a substitute. All right. So data collection. The authors indicate 6 methods of data collection: tests or standardized instruments. I think standardized instruments is a better term for these things. I think they use the word tests because it's in education, but in the health sciences world, we are often measuring not only achievement or ability, we're measuring, say, personality, quality of life, self-efficacy, these constructs for which there are instruments that have been designed that are very well established. A lot of work has gone into ensuring that they're valid and reliable. Questionnaires, on the other hand, are essentially the vessel in which a lot of these other things are situated. So a questionnaire is simply a listing of potentially tests, quantitative interviews, demographic questions, open-ended questions. So a questionnaire is more of a tool than it is an actual type of data. Interviews can be quantitative or qualitative. A quantitative interview is a very structured, often closed-ended tool in which you're basically reading through a questionnaire, versus a qualitative interview, which are open-ended and designed to allow the participant or the respondent to talk through and describe in detail their experiences or their understanding of different topics or issues of concern to your research. Focus groups are essentially group-based qualitative interviews. They're, again, containing primarily open-ended questions, and they're conducted with groups of people to spark additional discussion on topics and at even further depth. Observations, quantitative observations, are simply when you are counting your observations of certain behavior, versus qualitative observations, which exist on a continuum from being very external to what you're observing to being embedded, highly situated in what you're observing. Then there is secondary or existing data. This is the idea that a lot of artifacts are generated over time, whether it's books, documents, videos, photography, newspapers. This material exists and it can actually be your source of data, and you can analyze it using quantitative or qualitative techniques. So that's essentially it for data collection. Pretty straightforward concepts, and the text does a good job of covering it. Okay, so sampling. Basically, I'll be covering quantitative and qualitative sampling terminology. And to start off with, in quantitative sampling, there's the idea of random versus non-random. So random is basically a probability-based sampling technique. It's a method of drawing a portion of a population so that each member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. And that's essentially what simple random sampling is. Put everyone's name in a hat who could possibly be in the study and randomly pull out the number that you need. And there's obviously better ways to implement this using statistical packages, but the essential idea is you start with a sampling frame, randomly select people to be a part of your study. So systematic sampling is a way of implementing simple random sampling in a very systematic way. It involves randomly selecting a number to start in your sampling frame, and basically once you've identified that starting point, you would select every kth element to be a part of your sample. But you're going to start at a randomly selected starting point. Stratified random sampling is the idea that you can divide your sampling frame into different strata, males and females, for example, or different ethnic groups, for example. And once you've divided the strata into those, or the sample into those strata, you select within the strata randomly. So you randomly select within the strata as opposed to across the strata. And the reasons you might be doing this is because you want to ensure a certain proportion of individuals are coming from each of the different strata. Then there is cluster random sampling, and this is very important for educational research because a lot of times our students exist in clusters, and so rather than sampling students across different classrooms, we might sample the actual classrooms themselves. And then they introduce the idea of two-stage cluster sampling, and this is where initially you select the clusters randomly, and then within the clusters you also implement some form of random selection of individuals. So then we move into non-random versions of sampling, and this is a likely place that your research will be. And the most likely place is in this idea of convenience sampling. And if you're in this world, it's not the end of the world. It just means that you might not necessarily be able to generalize back to your target population. You will be able to generalize to whatever characteristics your sample end up having. Quota sampling is another version of this. And in fact, it's similar to proportional stratified random sampling, where you are trying to get a certain number of people who have certain characteristics. And so purposive sampling is the idea that you are looking for maybe information-rich cases to study in depth. Snowball sampling is the idea that participants are asked to identify other potential participants. So you find someone who's representative of the person you're interested in studying, and then you ask them to suggest other people, and eventually through this snowball technique you build your sample. And all of these non-random sampling techniques simply mean that whatever your sample ends up looking like is as far as you'll be able to generalize. Qualitative sampling deals with the idea that you are definitely in a purposive world. You are sampling for certain reasons, and you want to find cases that meet certain characteristics. The comprehensive sample is the idea that you're choosing an entire group based on a certain criteria. So you're trying to find as many cases that look similar as you can in order to conduct your qualitative inquiry. Maximum variation is where you're trying to get cases that cover the different combinations of certain characteristics that you could see in a certain situation or in a setting that you're interested in studying. Homogeneous is you're focusing on generating a sample that's got as few differences of perceptions about a topic that you're interested in studying. Extreme case sampling is when you are trying to find the opposite ends of an experience. So a person who has had an extremely positive experience, a person who's had an extremely negative experience, you interview those individuals, or you develop cases of those individuals, and then you compare and contrast their perceptions and experiences. That can be a very powerful way to make a point about the differences in the way in which people experience things. Typical case sampling is where you know the typical characteristics of a group and you select based on those typical cases, because you're hoping to maybe generate understanding of the typical situation and the typical experience. Negative case sampling, so this is where you have a hypothesis about how something will be experienced, and then you find someone who has experienced it completely opposite of what you expected. And those obviously can be very powerful examples to explore why a hypothesis isn't working the way you expected, and to shed more light on a certain experience. Opportunistic sampling is essentially where you are taking whoever you can get within a certain reason, of course. It's similar to the sample of convenience. You have access to a whole bunch of students, but only a few of them are willing to take part in a focus group about their experience in a given part of your program. The text also covers issues in terms of mixed methods sampling, and they describe two dimensions that you take into consideration. Timing, so whether or not the sample was taken at the same time versus sequentially. Then how related are the samples? Are they identical versus parallel versus nested or multi-level? So identical, obviously the same people are taking part in both parts of the study. Parallel means that you've got different people for the quantitative and the qualitative. Nested would be a situation where only certain people are coming out for the qualitative or the quantitative, but essentially they're a part of the original sample that was done first. And then multi-level would be people you're interested in studying that are related in different levels. So parents and their students would be a good example. Educators and their students would be another example. Mentors and their mentees, where you are in different parts of the study accessing different levels of participants.